Taoiseach, you were asked questions yesterday in the House about the new water tax and a standing charge, and you gave very little information to the members of the House. You did refer to a draft memo from Irish Water and play down its implications, but you failed to mention anything about a draft memo going to government this morning for a special meeting on water charges and the water tax issue, the details of which are covered extensively today in the Irish Times and in the Irish Independent in considerable detail. We learned, for example, that the average cost will be between €250 to €300, that the free allowance will consist of essentially a 7-minute power shower, a 3-minute tap run to brush your teeth, and 2 flushes of the toilet, and that's basically it. We learned that's the level of detail that was available this morning. There will be an annual standing charge, we're told, applying to all households, irrespective of how much water they use. Basically, householders will pay for every drop of water used beyond the most basic morning routine. And also we've learned that social welfare protection for low-income families and particularly for pensioners has been ruled out. I remember Taoiseach the Taoiseach stating in 2010, when he said very eloquently at that time, and I quote, "I'm against water charging. Water is a necessity. I've always believed essential services like water should be delivered as a public service." Yet, for some reason, the government have set up a very expensive regime in Irish Water, costing €180 million, a very complicated regime now, despite the fact that water will still be delivered, produced and delivered by the very same people that have been delivering it for decades past. What I want to ask you, Taoiseach, essentially is a number of questions. Were the Labour Party ministers informed about this level of detail in advance of the detail being circulated to the media by the government? Was a memo brought to government today on the new water tax, and was a decision taken? Can you confirm the free allowance is as revealed in the Irish Times and Irish Independent? And finally, Taoiseach, we meet many people in our duties across the country who say they have no more to give with all of the other charges that they've had to cope with. And particularly pensioners say this, who've been very hard hit by the last 2 budgets. Will there be, Taoiseach, will there be an ability? Thank you. Will there be an ability to pay provision in this regime, and will there be any link to a person's income or a person's capacity to pay? Thank you.
No assistant.
Thank Deputy Martin for his range of questions. Let me say to you that there's a lot on the government agenda that has to be considered. And this morning at a meeting that I called to deal with a number of matters, we approved the publication of the legislation dealing with free GP care for under 6s. We approved the publication of the bill dealing with climate change and carbon emissions, low production. We approved the changes recommended by the Minister for Education to the bill previously known as the Teaching Council Bill. And we had a first discussion about a proposal from the Minister for the Environment about the introduction of water charges. This is all about equity, equality, affordability and fair pricing. The situation, as Deputy Martin is only too well aware, is that we have a completely inferior infrastructure for water in many parts of the country. The state has failed to invest properly in this over the years, and that's why the Irish Water Utility is created, so that it can borrow money outside the government's balance sheet to provide that infrastructure for water for consumers, for business, and as a continued element of attraction for location here in the country. You asked me a number of questions. The Minister's memo sets out a range of issues that are important. Let me say that the government, comprised of the 2 parties, Fine Gael and Labour, are united in the objective of making the government's priority that water charges would be fair, would be affordable, and would be as equitable as possible. So we started that discussion this morning. The government noted the importance in our recovery plan that Irish Water, like both GOSH and the ESB, would be classified as a commercial semi-state body, the finances of which are separate from the government. In that way, Irish Water can fund much higher levels of investment to fix the inferior infrastructure that we have. And we did note the official advice from the Minister for the Environment that the level of taxpayer subvention for Irish Water, consistent with it being classified as a commercial state company, could not exceed a level of 537 million subvention in 2015 and 2016. And that equates to an annual average metered charge of €240 per annum. I want to say to you that the government have not signed off on these figures. There has been intensive engagement between the Department of the Environment and the Central Statistics Office in recent weeks to understand and comprehend the statistical rules that apply here in the case of how Eurostat applies its business.
Thank you.
You will be aware that the requirement for a market corporation test is a requirement that income from customers, ex-VAT where applicable, would be greater than 50% of production costs, including consumption of fixed capital and including interest. And these are important elements. So the CSO, in explaining the rules here, have explained the maximum level of subvention that's available. So what government continue to do now, Deputy Martin, is to discuss the questions of how you make this as affordable and as fair as possible for different categories of families. There are vulnerable groups here. One is where people live on their own, who may be very vulnerable, pensioners or whatever. The other are families with children, where there is a requirement obviously for extra water. But also the question of the scale of metering, the level of assessment, and the general issues that apply in respect of all of these things. You mentioned standing charges. These are matters in respect of which the Minister will give detailed policy directions to the regulator, who starts the public consultation tomorrow in respect of the structuring of the tariff, and we'll move on later to a more detailed analysis dealing with actual charges. So the answer to your question is that the issues that you raise, vulnerability, ability to pay, standing charges, all of these things are matters that the government will consider in the next 2 weeks, taking into account the overall headlines under the rules as explained by the Central Statistics Office to keep in line with the Eurostat requirements. I would say to you that if the market corporation test were failed, there would be an additional, if the market corporation test were failed,
over time here.
The consequence would be a 700 million capital cost being incurred by Irish Water, which would impact obviously on the government deficit and would have implications in that area. So the CSO, in explaining the rules, have set out what the maximum subvention can be for 2015 and 2016. I want to make it clear that the government have not signed off on any of these figures. We think it's important to discuss the elements surrounding that, the categories, the vulnerability, ability to pay, levels of metering, and so on. And we hope to conclude that in the next 2 weeks.
Deputy Martin, 1 minute.
You were anything but clear this morning. I mean, no one could decipher anything from what you're saying. And if you turned on Morning Ireland this morning and you listened to the political correspondent Martina Fitzgerald, you would have heard that the government was bringing this member to government today, and this was going to be announced today. By the end of Morning Ireland, you're told Labour Party rush in some news that they'd be told nothing about this. And the first question I asked you, were the Labour Party ministers told in advance about the details of Minister Hogan's memo before the memo was circulated to the media? And the memo was circulated to the media, Taoiseach. And it should be published now, in deference to this House and in deference to the public, because the public are being treated with absolute contempt in relation to this. And they're not that concerned about passing some corporate market test or market cooperation test that you're going on about.
Question,
With the
please.
greatest
Thank
of
you.
respect, Taoiseach, the pensioners I meet out there and the people I meet out there are basically concerned about what bill they will receive
please.
in the last quarter of this year. That's what people want to know. And people were aghast when they, first of all, saw the extravagance surrounding the establishment of Irish Water of €180 million. That annoyed and angered many, many people. And the secrecy surrounding that. Because you've been endeavouring to keep this under the radar for quite some time. You then made the comment you would publish everything well in advance of the local elections. And you haven't done that. But you keep trying to either leak or soften the blow or whatever. But the bottom line is this, Taoiseach. The public want to know how much they will be paying for water by the end of this year.
Thank you.
It's a very basic and simple request. And the only reason they don't know is that you and the Minister have deliberately delayed it until now. But it's about time we found out, Taoiseach, the actual details. And also, the final point you made is this. The government have not signed
We're
up.
over time.
Now, what does that mean, Taoiseach, in real terms?
Thank you.
Is it because Labour raised angrily the leaks or the circulation to the papers this morning, and you've deferred it from today?
Deputy, would you please?
What are the implications of that?
Thank you.
One question you didn't answer was, will there be an ability to pay provision in the regime that's been announced? Because the memo that circulated
Thank you, please.
that any welfare
We're way over
protection
time. Thanks, Deputy.
has been categorically ruled out by the government. And that's categorically in the reporting.
1 minute, Taoiseach, 1 minute. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you, Deputy Martin. Let's be clear then. I don't speak for any reporter in RTE. If the memo that you speak of were circulated, then I would have assumed a very competent reporter like who was speaking on Morning Ireland this morning would have had the details of what was contained in the memo. And obviously, she was very clear in the fact that she didn't have the details that you referred to. Now, like what we're talking about here. You've had your say now. You've had your say.
Sorry, would you hold on a second, Deputy?
You've had your say. You make a charge. You make a charge that memos were circulated to the media and all the rest of it. What we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is fairness, affordability, and a scheme that's workable in providing infrastructure for the next 50 years for this country, for business and for consumers alike. And the average charge, as set out by the rules by CSO, means that the bill that comes to people for an average metre charge next January is €60. Now, Deputy Martin, I want to say this to you. I want to say this to you. What it means, Deputy Martin, when I say to you...
Taoiseach, I'm going to have to ask you to finish because they're not listening to you and we're over time. Thank you.
When I say to you, Deputy Martin, that when the government have not signed off on a memo, on a proposal from a minister, it means that the government have the right to discuss all of the issues surrounding that, including vulnerable groups, affordability, assessments, metering, standing charges and all these things. And I'll tell you something else. I take very little notice of those who are opportunistic hypocrites, of which you're the leader. Here's your programme. Here's your programme. You see, here's your programme. Here's your programme. The Fianna Fáil 4-year programme. The Fianna Fáil 4-year programme. We'll transfer water services provisions to a water utility and prepare proposals for implementation as appropriate, with a view to start charging in 2012 and 2013 with an average charge of €400.